here to engage in our second environmental justice rulemaking stakeholder meeting with a particular focus today on those items that concern business, industry, trade, and builders organizations. So for today's discussion, we're going to focus on two specific aspects of the legislation and the rulemaking, and that's around geographic points of comparison and permit and facility definitions. If you were not able to join us for our first meeting, I just want to make a note to you that you can always go to our environmental justice website at DEP. It's nj.gov/DEP/EJ. And there you can find our October 22nd stakeholder meeting, where we spent some time looking broadly at the environmental justice legislation, framing what environmental justice is, understanding what that looks like in our landscape, and how it shows up in previous and past planning and zoning decisions, and what we're looking to remedy and the direction that we're looking to go. So I don't want to take a lot of time today going down framing those particular aspects, but do know that those resources are available. We certainly want to dedicate as much time as we can today to get into these specific elements within the law and our rule. So I'm just going to note a few things as a matter of just netiquette for us working together in this virtual environment that we unfortunately have had to spend way too much time becoming accustomed to at this point. Nonetheless, it's a vital tool to help us keep all connected and continue moving forward. Just if you come on and if you can just mute your microphones if you're not speaking. We will have some opportunities where you will be able to speak and ask us questions. At that time, you can unmute yourself, but we would ask that you then immediately return to putting yourself on mute. We are recording today's meeting. So of course that helps with feedback, it helps with overall efficiency, and it'll give us a nice solid record of what we're doing today. There is a raise hand function across the top of the toolbar in case you're not used to this tool. It looks like a hand in the air like this. And if you click on that, we will recognize that as you're raising your hand to ask a question, and we will acknowledge hands that are raised. There is also a chat function. On my screen, it's to the left of that raised hand. And with that chat function, it looks like the cartoon thought box. If you click on that, you can type something in there and it will populate. We will all see it. It will be a part of the record. And as much as we can today, we're going to answer those questions. If we are not able to answer every question, we assure you that we will give full diligence to every question that is raised. And if we are in fact able to answer it, we will follow up as we did after the first meeting to provide answers to any inquiry that comes up today. So we're going to ask, just in terms of facilitating the conversation and the best possible outcome for this rulemaking process, that we treat everyone with respect, even if we don't agree with the position that they raise. You can raise your position respectfully as well. We'd like everyone to just limit their comments or questions to the topic being discussed, and to limit your comments to 2 minutes. And you will see me raise my hand in the background as you approach 90 seconds of your comment, if it carries on, just for the sake of time and expediency. And just want to underscore that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our DEP website after this session concludes. So I am delighted to be here today to facilitate this conversation with Sean Moriarty, who is our Chief Advisor on Regulatory Affairs. He is outstanding. I'm sure many of you know him. So he's going to dig into some of the deeper aspects. But I just have one thought that I want to put out there before I hand it over to him. And it is that even from an environmental justice community's perspective, businesses are integral to the community. What we're looking to achieve through this process is the reaching of a triple bottom line of social, economic, and environmental benefits for communities. And business and industry are a vital partner in helping us make that happen. So with that in mind, I'd like to pass the baton over to my esteemed colleague, Sean, to pick it up from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today to continue our conversation on our environmental justice rulemaking. So first, before we get started, we can go to the next slide. Before we get started with the conversation of the geographic point of comparison and our facility definitions, I just want to bring everybody up to speed on where we are in terms of the notification requirements under the bill. We can go to the next slide. So as everybody is likely aware, the bill defines overburdened communities to meet these three criteria: 35% of households qualifying as low income, 40% of residents identifying as minority or members of the state recognized tribal community, or at least 40% of those households have limited English proficiency. We go to the next slide. So what the bill requires in this regard, it was within, as of yesterday, we were required to provide notice to municipalities where overburdened communities were located. So we did that. We have rolled out some pretty interesting products, which we'll talk about in a second, and we'll show you where you can find those, including some interactive mappings. You can get down to an address and property level to determine whether a specific place is located within an overburdened community. So I just want to point out first that we've updated our analysis to use more recent data from what folks may have seen when we were discussing the bill back last year. So that new analysis is now based on data made available as of December of last year, which, if you are keeping track, is less than a month ago, and that is a tribute to the folks who work in the department and their diligence that we were able to update all of this information within that very short period of time. And that is an update from what has been previously shown and what was used in the environmental justice guidance. And as you can see on the screen, throughout the state, combining all of those different categories, we have a total of 3,168 block groups, which qualify as overburdened communities within the definition the legislature has set out, and that those block groups include 4.5 million people. So as you can see on the screen with the different colors, those are where those overburdened block groups lie within the state. We can go to the next slide. So what we did yesterday was we gave notice to all of the municipalities directly to the mayors of all of those towns, and included some information which you can now find on our environmental justice website. And that includes an Excel spreadsheet which lists the overburdened communities. That's fairly technical and fairly boring. I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to spend too much time there. But the other information we have is actually more interesting and more useful. So first, we have a simple GIS tool and a GIS file that folks can download and manipulate themselves. And that's what we referenced earlier, where you can zoom into a specific property. You can see, you can search by address, including your own, and determine whether those properties are located within an overburdened community. You'll be able to see those block groups. You'll be able to look at the statistics as to how they qualify for overburdened community within the legislature's definition and all that good stuff. We're also including PDF maps of each of the overburdened communities for ease of use. You'll be able to pull those maps up. You can pull up Camden City, for instance, and see exactly where those block groups lie and how they are designated. So we're hoping that one, we've fulfilled our statutory obligation to give notice, but two, really put out some useful information for folks who are eager to start to dig into some of this data and to start to see, what the landscape looks like as we continue these conversations. And also, I'll just note that we are going to be holding a webinar sometime in the next, I think the first week of February. We'll be holding a webinar for municipal officials so we can explain and show folks exactly how those determinations were reached by applying the census data to the legislative definition. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so now into kind of more of the meat of what we're talking about. So first, our first topic of discussion today is what we've been calling our geographic point of comparison. So what exactly does that mean? Well, I think we start by looking at the key language of the law. And that language requires the department to compare the environmental and public health stressors faced by overburdened communities with those borne by other communities within the state, county, or other geographic unit as determined by the department. So based on that language, and as we shared during our last conversation, the department has looked at the analysis in a couple of ways, and we're going to walk you through today how that could work and what some of the results might look like. And we would be looking at both state and county comparisons, including and excluding from that analysis the existing overburdened communities. And before we get there, let me just provide a little bit of background on how this and everything else we talk about fits into the overall our overall plan with this rulemaking. We are building this rule through stakeholdering from the ground up, utilizing small and what we hope are manageable pieces. At this point in the process, no decisions have been made, and we are truly and eagerly seeking your input on each step of the way. And this is really step one in that process. So what we'll talk about today is will end up being part of a larger method and approach. And while we won't get to specific issues such as, what are the stressors that will be what we're looking at, how will those stressors be evaluated and compared, and what does the ultimate permitting process look like? Those conversations will be coming in the next few months. So we just ask you to keep that in mind. But this is really the first place we start as we build to that, and we can't get to that end point without doing a lot of this legwork in advance. So in light of that reality, if we solicit comments and you feel you can't commit to a comment or a position until the full process is laid out, that's certainly understandable. But we would really urge everyone to speak up and help to inform us now. So we get to that point later on where we're talking about the full process, we have as much of relevant information as possible. Okay, so back to the task at hand. I'll be presenting a series of maps and tables with data and statistics to help explain what we're seeing so far. And if you're concerned about why, the department's lawyer talking about math, obviously I went to law school because I couldn't do math. We have our experts here as well who can help to answer some of the harder, more challenging statistical analysis questions anybody might have. So don't be afraid to ask. The information we're going to present today is intended to both inform and be open and transparent about the analysis that we can do and have done. It's not to confuse. So if it gets technical at any point, forgive us. We really are trying to provide as much information as possible and to give folks, as much insight into the process as we can. So as Olivia indicated, if there are any questions along the way, please ask. I'd like to make this conversation as informal and open as we can. I will ask specific questions throughout the process, but if something comes up while I'm going through the slides, please just raise your hand and we'll discuss. And for illustration purposes, we have chosen one potential stressor for now, and we will, as we add more stressors to the analysis later, we do expect that the results that you're going to see here will be similar as we continue to add those stressors. So we can go on to the next one. Okay, so first we'll just talk about some of the comments received. So as you're aware, we issued, we asked for written comments. We also issued a survey after the last conversation, and we just want to touch briefly on the results of that survey. And judging by the responses, I think our first reaction was we probably missed the mark on our question. I think when we asked what is the appropriate geographic unit, we probably should have been asking what is the appropriate geographic unit for comparison purposes. So our review of the comments received seemed to indicate that folks may have looked more at how we should consider an overburdened community, focusing on the smallest unit possible rather than what that comparison unit is. But we did see some useful results, particularly in folks who are identifying both state and county as potentially being options, as well as people who thought either the state or the county were options. So those are at least help us to understand where we should have focused our discussion tonight. And go to the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are going to use one example stressor for this conversation. And for that, we chose the air cancer risk data developed by the US EPA under the National Scale Air Toxics Assessment, or NADA program. And this estimates cancer risk from various sources of air pollution through inventory analysis and deposition modeling. And we picked this because it's a well-known data set and used in similar tools like EPA's EJ screen, and we thought it would serve as a useful starting point for the analysis. And the unit used for this, what you'll see throughout, is cancer risk per million. And the map you see here shows New Jersey's NADA data separated into 10% increments. So if you refer back to that earlier slide, that would be kind of 630 block groups of the 6,300 block groups. So each of those color gradients would be about 630 block groups. And that shows the distribution across the state of this data. The darker the blue, the higher the cancer risk is. So, you see this and you'll start to, as we go through these maps, you'll start to see some consistency in terms of where those cancer risks are and where those overburdened communities might lie. So if you look at the chart, the mean cancer risk per million for the state is 249. The median, which is the same as the 50th percentile number, is 222, and the 80th percentile number is 325. So I think that sets the stage for what we're working with. Now let's look at it in a slightly different way. So what this slide does is this takes that prior analysis and shows what those numbers look like in the non-overburdened communities statewide. So now you're looking at the state numbers without including those areas classified as overburdened communities, that 3,000 plus block groups. And as we would expect, for these non-overburdened areas, the numbers are lower in the state as a whole. For example, the median or 50th percentile is now 190 per million, as opposed to 222 for the state as a whole. We can move on to the next slide. Continuing now, we can shift our focus to the county level. And since I live in Camden County and I'm broadcasting live from there as we speak, and since I got to be the one who's doing the talking today, I decided to use that one as an example. So Camden County has 382 block groups. Looking at the numbers, they show that the NADA cancer risk for the county is generally lower than the state as a whole, median excluded, but higher than the state after you remove the overburdened communities. And as you can certainly see, and I think if you look at this map, you certainly see how those numbers end up concentrated in the waterfront areas near Camden County. So continuing on, we'll look at the fourth geographic unit we've looked at so far, the non-overburdened block groups in Camden County. Again, as expected, those non-OBCs in Camden County are lower than Camden as a whole, highlighting the 50th and 80th percentile numbers on the screen. So now you've seen on a county level what those numbers can be used to compare areas to determine if an overburdened community block group is higher than those borne by the other communities, potentially subject to the permitting provisions of the EJ law. And the next slides will look at how those overburdened community comparisons change for the different geographic areas at these two percentiles, 50 and 80. Okay, so what does this comparison look like in practice? So we break it down under each of the four scenarios in Camden County. This chart shows the number of overburdened community block groups that exceed the 50th percentile, numbers that we showed you before, to demonstrate which block groups are higher than the different the different levels. The table is ranked from highest to lowest based on the cancer risk levels in the different comparison areas. It shows that Camden County, for this stressor level, the county is as a whole is the highest comparison level with a cancer risk of 237 per million, with the state non-OBC area representing the lowest comparison level at 190. So the map on the left shows that same data included in a table visually to show where those block groups are that exceeded different levels. So if you look at those different colors, you can see how they match up with the things in the table. So for example, if the county as a whole was used this comparison, that is the highest risk, 98 block groups, those in the dark green, again, the waterfront, would be considered higher than the 237 per million cancer risk level. Moving down the table, if we used county non-OBC, non-overburdened communities, again, removing the overburdened communities from the comparison, that would add an additional 4 block groups, those in the light green. So you start to kind of move out from the waterfront. Using the state level numbers, that would add an additional 11 block groups as we're kind of moving down the scale to lower and lower numbers. And those are the ones in dark blue. You can see those towards the middle of your screen. And then lastly, if we were to use the state with the non-overburdened communities, again, comparing statewide while I'm removing all of the overburdened communities, you would get a total of 134 block groups that would be considered higher, and that's the light blue. And that would be, on that number, using the lowest number, that would be all of those colors combined would be the areas that would be considered higher than. And that would leave 46 block groups that would meet the overburdened community census criteria that would end up not being higher than any of those geographic comparison areas. And that's just kind of tried to make a simplified example of how we could run through an analysis to determine higher than. So I think looking at this, it pretty accurately tells the story of how these numbers work. As we talked about, the Camden City waterfront is obviously an area of concern, so it's captured even at the highest threshold. And as we move down those numbers, you can see how that projection ends up spreading out over other areas. So now we can look at that same comparison, but we can use the 80th percentile as the threshold, just to show kind of what things look like when you apply a different statistical threshold. So ranking the geographic areas changes slightly, with the state as a whole being the highest level, and with the state non-OBC area as the lowest level again. A total of 98 block groups would be considered higher, compared to 134 for the 50th percentile. 82 block groups that meet the overburdened community census criteria would not be higher than those for the geographic comparisons, and that is compared to 46 when we used 50% as the threshold. Okay, so we've done that analysis. We've tried to zoom it in. Now let's zoom it out and try to show you visually what this looks like when you start to apply these numbers across the state, right? So the map and table on the left shows the block groups and populations that are higher in the percentiles ranging from 50 to 80 if we use the state as the comparison area. So again, you can see that color gradient. You can see that, you know, the counties up in the northeastern part of the state generally would meet the highest threshold. Where, you know, you start to move down to the state, you're going to find places that are caught in the analysis that would receive those extra protections as you go down the scale from 80 to 50. It really does show how the population covered increases as you move that level down. The blue to green area shows the population covered by those different percentiles. The gray areas are the overburdened community block groups meeting the census criteria, but not higher than the 50th percentile. If the 50th percentile was used as the higher than threshold, that would capture approximately 67% of the population in the overburdened community block groups. Now, the map on the table to the right shows that same information if we were just to use county as the comparison. Again, same analysis, you know, same gradient with the colors, but there are some important differences that become apparent as you walk through this analysis when you change from state to county. First, several block groups in generally lower stress counties are now covered, and now those are in areas in the south, such as Atlantic and Cumberland County, and the north, such as Somerset and Morris. Now, those are covered when you do the county comparison as opposed to the state comparison. Also, several block groups in generally higher stress counties are not covered, and that would be Hudson, Middlesex, Bergen, and Union. And I think specifically stark when you see that little donut hole that now shows up in the northeastern part of our state around Hudson County, when you use the county comparison, because Hudson is comparatively more subject to more stressors than some of the other counties. When it's compared to itself, you start to lose protections up in that area. So I think what this analysis highlights again is that there are block groups where the stressor level is higher than the state, but lower than the county, because that county already has high stress levels. Conversely, it shows that in comparatively cleaner counties, using, you know, our shorthand, counties with lower stress levels than the state, you could pick up other block groups. I think when you go through this analysis, it shows that there is a distinct lack of statewide uniformity in comparing at state and county levels, and I think you can see that just visually by using this map as you see which areas are and are not covered. So now we move on to the last two discrete examples we wanted to talk about today. State and county with the removal of those overburdened communities. Due to the lower stress levels in non-overburdened communities, community areas, we cover a larger percentage of OBCs in both instances. So the state increases from 67 to 87% as the 50th percentile, whereas the county increases from 60 to 65%. And again, that lack of uniformity that we talked about, even at that at that 80th percentile, shows up again. You still have that area up in and around Hudson County that ends up not being protected when you make the county comparison, even excluding the overburdened communities, really highlighting the stress level present in that area. And now we get to the last slide. So I think recognizing that lack of statewide consistency when making a state or county comparison, we thought it was prudent to look at what we're calling a hybrid approach, which considers the lower of the state and county levels. So in doing this, we are considering whether it is fairer and more equitable to provide a level of protection for relatively lower stress counties and using the state level for higher stress counties. The map on the left is based on selecting the lower of the state or county level. The map on the right is the same for the state and county, but excluding those non-overburdened community areas. At the 50th percentile, the non-OBC combined approach covers 87% of the OBC block groups population, as compared to 78% for the state and county as a whole. And that's compared to the numbers that were largely in the 60s as far as coverage when we were using one or the other. And as you'll likely notice, this approach, using this hybrid approach, really does avoid those gaps in Hudson County, while also including those overburdened communities that might need that protection down in South Jersey. So I'm hopeful that I didn't confuse things more than they already are. I'm hopeful that this analysis sheds some light on our thought process in working through this issue and illustrates the type of analysis we can do moving forward as we evaluate other stressors and develop a more complete method for implementation. We're more than willing to do additional analysis if folks have things that they think we need to look at, and we're open to considering different ideas and approaches. So with that, I'd like to open the floor up for any questions that folks have on these issues. And those, the questions on the screen are fairly self-explanatory. If you have questions about the analysis, if there are other geographic units we think should be considered, and really kind of wanting to highlight that question of, due to the differences in state and county comparisons, how do folks believe it is appropriate to combine those comparisons for this purpose? And then, for example, as we talked about, selecting the lowest of state or county when you're looking at individual block groups. So do we have questions?
Sean, I will note for you that we have not yet received any questions in the chat. So
Okay.
You did a remarkable job with that overview. So we certainly will give everyone a moment to process and see if they come up with any questions.
Either that, or I was so unclear that folks don't even know how to phrase questions. And if I was, I do apologize. And next time I'll make Steve do it. But yeah, we can wait a minute, and then if not, we'll move on to the second part of the conversation. Ray.
Well, thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Sean. I'm jumping in here only because no one has their hands raised yet, and I figured I would add something to this conversation, although you threw a lot at us, and I'm not sure if I have any significant thought to add, but I'll try as well. One, based on your earlier comments, Sean, about we'll be talking about other definitions and how to look at overburdened communities differently later. That the NADA example is really just an example of how statistics can be compared and yes, not where you're headed. So I'll ignore all that for the moment. Again, and you guys broke it down in so many different ways. I'm really going to have to go back there and look at all those different potential scenarios to see what makes sense. But I think we ultimately have to fall back on what is the legislation trying to accomplish. And it's the idea that there are certain areas that, for whatever reasons, are bearing a disproportionate burden of stressors. And we want to make sure that if any new stressors or existing stressors there are renewed or expanded, that the department take an additional look at that and apply more stringent criteria to that. So with that baseline, again, we think that when you're doing your comparison, that you need to compare basically apples to apples and not have it done on a statewide basis. That again, our recommendation was regional or county, because again, the Northeast is very different than the South, and I'm not sure if you're really making appropriate comparisons if you're comparing regions or parts of the state to each other that really aren't comparable for historical and other development reasons. While a regional approach, however you break it down, might be the more scientifically or justifiable basis, from an ease of application, the department may want to consider a county-wide basis. Again, it's just easier for you to do and easier for you to justify. There is no comparative basis that you're going to come up with that's going to make everybody happy, or that's going to be a perfect tool in order to implement this act. I think every overburdened community is going to have the analysis done. All you're really doing right now is determining which ones you may say no to or impose additional conditions on based upon that comparison. So everyone will get the benefit of having the environmental justice impact statement done and the hearings done. So all that information will be out there, and so the first 2/3 of the bill are done regardless of what you decide on the comparative basis. We're only talking about who gets special benefits, ability to say no, or ability to impose mitigation, et cetera, at the end. So again, it's not going to be perfect. Our recommendation would be, again, regional or for more efficiency county. And given the significant 4.5 million people are in overburdened communities under the mapping, if we were only talking about a few communities, I would argue that it makes sense to exclude them from the analysis for the comparison's sake. But since everyone is in that, since over half the state is an overburdened community, I don't think it makes sense to exclude them from your comparative analysis. They're going to be overburdened communities which may have really no burdens, but they're there just because we're using statistics and not environmental impacts, in that definitional sense. Just because you are poor or a minority population doesn't mean that there's any air sites, et cetera, there. So thank you, Olivia. I assume the hand was for me. I appreciate that. So again, our point is do it county, do it regional, if you want, leave the overburdened communities in there. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. I'd like to ask one follow-up question back to you.
Sure.
So the regional approach is something that's certainly on our mind. Have you given thought, or can you, I guess, if not today, but how would you kind of group regions, or are there criteria that you would specifically look at that you would think we should base an analysis of how we would kind of slice regions up across the state? Like, I understand, I definitely see your point. Like, there are certain different development patterns, and if you were comparing kind of the northeastern part of the state as a whole to kind of the southwestern part of the state, that it looks different. It looks different, right? Everybody knows they look different when you drive through it. So have you thought about how maybe some objective criteria that could be applied to help us to draw some of those lines at all?
I will think about that. I will get back to you with recommendations. I was going to leave that heavy thinking to you folks.
Sure.
Again, I'm a simplistic person, which is why I would recommend county. It's not going to be perfect, but
Right.
it's there. Everyone realizes those boundaries, and I think it's a much easier comparison. If you were doing a regional analysis, again, I will get back to you. But what you have the statistics, and looking at the census data and the population data, maybe you base it on population density type scenario. So you're comparing similar type of areas to each other. I think it can be done, but whatever you're going to do is not going to be perfect. So if you're looking for the perfect, you might just outthink yourselves as opposed to a simplistic approach.
Well, I think knowing me, I don't normally outthink myself, right? That's not too difficult for me to not do that. But thank you. And I think, to your point, part of what we're looking at is how do we, through this process, find a way to appropriately match up those stressors with the OBC criteria, right? I think we recognize that the bill cuts a very wide swath through the state in terms of what those overburdened communities are, and what we're trying to do here, and part of what we work through the process, and we will continue to show you how we're going to do that, is to try to match up those stressors with that overburden community criteria, to make sure that we are targeting the right people, the ones most in need of the additional protections that the bill seeks. So thank you. I always appreciate the comments. We have one question in the chat from Matt Carmel from Riker. Question is, why I understand the evaluation of other stressors is to come. Does the state believe it has or can generate enough data to perform similar statistical analysis for other stressors? The answer to that, Matt, is absolutely. That is going to be the topic of our next conversation, which will be next month. And Olivia will talk a little bit about where we're headed in terms of the next step meetings there. But yes, and I think we have ample data available to us that we can break down onto a block group level and be able to do this analysis. And we will at our next conversation start to talk to you about what that data looks like and what we think we can do with it. Are there any? I don't see any other hands up. So I'm going to assume that it's a lot of information, and I think that's fine. With all of this, this PowerPoint, this conversation is to start where we're headed, is to start the back and forth. So folks have written comments. If folks want to talk to us more about this afterwards, we're obviously open to that. We appreciate the time to listen to us talk to you about it, so that we can kind of move into more of a back and forth, even if it's a little bit much at this particular moment to digest. So thank you all. So let's move on to the next piece. So this is the facility and permits definition portion of our conversation today. And we can go on to the next slide, which we'll talk about. I'm just going to remind folks, if you don't specifically recall all the requirements of the bill, it establishes a three-pronged test of applicability where we would need to look at applying additional protections. First is the question is whether the facility is one of the 8 types of facilities listed in the law, and those are the ones that you see on your screen: major sources of air pollution, resource recovery facilities or incinerators, large sewage treatment plants, transfer stations, recycling facilities, scrap metal facilities, landfills, and medical waste incinerators. That's the second question we ask, is whether the facility in question is seeking one of the subset of environmental permits listed in the bill, and that includes our solid waste and recycling permits, certain development permits, wetlands, CAFRA, flood hazard, water supply and water pollution permits, air pollution permits, and pesticide permits. So the third piece is whether the facility is seeking to be located in an overburdened community. So while the law defines what is considered overburdened community, as we've talked about already, it largely leaves it to the department to better define these facilities and permits. And that's what we are going to discuss today. How exactly we think we might go about doing that, and try to solicit some feedback here. As a regulator, we have many, many regulations, some containing definitions that could be incorporated, or where they don't line up exactly with the language of the bill, which we've discovered is quite the case, could be modified for incorporation into this rulemaking. So we felt would be useful to frame the discussion that way. For each of the definitions you see for each of the facilities and permits you see on the screen here, we'll tell you how they are defined in as plain English as we can in our regulations, or where they're not defined, the boundaries of those definitions, and try to solicit feedback on each. Again, if any of this is too technical, we're happy to take comments as we move forward. So what I just want to remind folks here is, when you're talking about applicability, you need that nexus between a facility and a permit, right? So we can define facilities a certain way. We can define them broadly. We can define them narrowly. We can define them as they are defined in our regulations. But even if they meet that definition, if they do not require a permit from the department, then they would not be covered. So we got to talk about exactly how that all works. And I think folks who've been in this area a while will recognize that when you look at those development permits, they potentially serve as a catch-all for some of these things. So we're going to go through that piece by piece and break it down. First, we're going to start with major sources of air pollution. Now, despite what I just went through about how the EJ law doesn't give us much guidance, this is the one place it does, and it actually does provide us with a definition of a major source. And that definition includes reference to the Federal Clean Air Act, as well as our Air Pollution Control Act rules, and defines those as a facility which can emit, or has the potential to emit, 100 tons or more of any air pollutant or other applicable criteria set forth in the Clean Air Act. So given the statutory direction, one approach could be to simply incorporate the definitions of major source and major facility. Those two are connected just in terms of how you regulate and their associated pollution thresholds into the rulemaking. And now this would cover things like electric generation facilities, refineries, waste handling facilities, including wastewater plants, municipal waste combustors, incinerators, and landfills. This would cover a fairly large number of those facilities that we're talking about if they meet those emission thresholds. So as we're looking at that, I think it'd be a good place to pause and just ask folks, when you're looking at a major source of air pollution, when you're looking at it from either your or your client's perspective, and the thought of those sources, those Title V permitting sources being captured by this bill, are there reactions to that? Are there concerns with kind of just adopting that approach wholesale, or would you recommend tweaks? Ray.
Just a question.
Yep.
Is that list essentially the Title V list plus a few additional facilities? Is that what we're talking about, or is
yes.
there?
Yeah, I think generally yes.
No, again, I'd love for you to tweak it and eliminate certain things, but at least our reading has always been that's what the law required. So, at least from our perspective, we think that's what the law requires.
Quite fair. Thank you. Toby Hanna, I believe your hand is up as well.
Yeah, Sean, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can. How are you, sir?
Very good, very good. Nice job so far. You and Olivia do an awesome job with this.
Yeah,
just thinking, really, I think what means the most to us is what, not just the facility definition, but what permitting events would actually be looked at.
Okay.
If we do a Title V facility gets modified often multiple times a year. Sometimes it's for emission decreases. Sometimes you're taking out units and entire emission sources are going away. Sometimes it's for installation of new air pollution control equipment. So there's multiple mechanisms for modifying a Title V permit. And we'd want to look at how to which triggers would actually get the extended EJ review and which would be deemed beneficial and not necessarily needed. I think that's an important point to consider. I don't know if you've gone down that road yet. I haven't heard that bit yet.
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to touch on that as we move forward, but that's exactly the type of thing we're hoping to talk about today, hoping to get that feedback on, Toby. So I do appreciate that. I mean, I think that certainly in our mind is how we deal with those types of things. The bill would exclude minor mods that reduce emissions, but if we're talking about a major mod to a Title V permit, exactly how we'd handle those. If you're reducing emissions, I can certainly see the logic in that not requiring that additional review, because you are getting in a lot of ways to what the bill is talking about. But that's something that's certainly under consideration.
And that could have some companies thinking, well, I've got a major change to make to my plant. How can I make that an emission reduction as opposed to an increase, and avoid the extra time and uncertainty of that review, if they can turn it into a net benefit. So it's a bit of an incentive to hang out there, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, when you're ready to talk the details of those nuances, I'd certainly be willing to weigh in on helping how to draw those lines. In terms of your question on what a Title V facility is, it's well defined, it's well established. I mean, it's a bright line. I can't see you guys getting away from that. It's really just the mechanisms for changing it and which ones of those would trigger the environmental justice review.
Excellent. We'll definitely be counting on your further input as we move forward. And I was hoping this would be a fairly easy one to start this conversation. It seems like we may have gotten that right. Ray, are you back? Sean. Thanks, Toby.
Well, are we going to be talking? I just want to follow up on Toby, but I don't have to right now. Are you going to be talking about what permits are triggered?
Yes.
I'll hold my comment. I'll hold my comments then.
Yeah, we're going to go through the specific permits as well. We'll do the facilities first, then we'll go through the permits, and we can engage more. Thank you, Ray. Okay, let's move on. So, as you all probably recognize, many of the facilities of concern, the ones that are listed in the bill, fall into that kind of broad category of solid waste facilities, resource recovery facilities, incinerators, transfer stations, recycling facilities, and landfills. So we would likely include a general definition that covers those, pulling from our solid waste regulations. And then we would develop specific definitions for each facility type. And then we'll kind of go in and talk about that. So first, we'll start with incinerators. Right. So, both our solid waste and our Air Pollution Control Act rules include definitions for incinerators. And, rather than kind of just cut and paste those definitions on the screen, we did try to break them down into their component parts just to make it a little bit easier for folks to kind of understand in a little bit less technical jargon. So generally, those facilities are characterized to include ones that reduce, destroy, or salvage materials by combustion. And those materials would include solid waste, garbage, debris, and human and pet remains. So it covers everything from a solid waste incinerator to a crematorium. And to address the statutory requirements, which we talked about before, we would likely need to expand those definitions to expressly include sludge and medical waste, because the legislation requires us to look at sludge incinerators and medical waste incinerators. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of how we would define sludge and medical waste, but I just want to put a pin in that for now. And obviously, under our rules, that doesn't include control technologies, and resource recovery facilities are otherwise defined. So I think, just for the purpose of this, I'm going to keep kind of rolling through here. If you have questions, just please raise your hand on any of these particular slides or whatever, and we will stop. But I don't want to ask the same questions over and over again if people are trying to kind of pull their questions together or pull their thoughts together. Excuse me. There's a question in the chat from John Kastner. Will being a major source capture hazardous waste facilities that may have otherwise been exempt from this law? Well, so I think if that hazardous waste facility would qualify as a major source, I'm not sure we would have grounds to exclude it otherwise. I understand that the bill does not specifically call it hazardous waste facilities as a category, but if they do fall within the definition of a major source, we would likely need to consider them. But if there are specific and compelling reasons why that should not be the case, we're certainly open to having that conversation and hearing that feedback. I think we would have to focus on, what about those facilities would be appropriate to exclude them from a major source analysis if they are meeting any of those emission thresholds. Okay, so we'll move on a little bit to a discussion of resource recovery facilities. This is somewhat similar to what we've talked about with incinerators, again, defined both in our Solid Waste and Air Pollution Control Act rules. And what we are at least looking at this point as being potential is to include those facilities that are used for processing, incineration, and other means for the separation of solid waste or recycling for reuse, energy production, or material recovery. Again, if anybody has any questions, wants to throw their hand up on any of these definitions where they are problematic or otherwise, please let me know as we go through. I think that the approach for transfer stations, again, similar. That's defined in our solid waste rules. What we would intend to do there is define those facilities as ones where solid waste is transferred from one vehicle to another for offsite transportation. Now, this would exclude, per the definition of our solid waste rules, self-generated on-site movements. So folks who might have a facility where you're moving waste back and forth yourself in your own trucks, that would not be considered a transfer station. Would be looking more properly at ones that are bringing waste in and moving it out. I think we would look similarly at recycling facilities. Again, this is one of those areas where you get into a little bit of a difference in terms of how the bill defines things versus how regulations define things. Under our recycling rules, they're defined as recycling centers, and that includes, and I'm hopeful we'll have a little bit of feedback here. Now, that includes Class B, C, and D recycling facilities, but as folks who are involved in the recycling industry know, that the statute specifically exempts from the department's direct permitting Class A facilities, which are more of kind of at least what I would consider to be our standard recycling facilities. The things you put out on the curb do not require permitting under these specific rules. So one question I would like to ask here, and I'm hoping we will get some feedback on, is how should we handle Class A facilities? How should they be addressed under this rule, under our environmental justice rules? Should they be excluded, or should they be required to conduct an environmental justice analysis separate and apart from whether they require a permit under the recycling rules by their inclusion in a county waste plan, or potentially by their requirement in some instances to receive land use permits? So with that, I think we have a hand up, and I'm hopeful we'll get some feedback. I have Danielle Waterfield.
Hi.
Hi, Danielle.
This is Danielle. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm from the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, and we represent scrap recycling facilities of all commodities across the nation and numerous facilities in New Jersey, and Class A recycling facilities, as you described. And we did submit some comments after the first hearing, and our position with your question really is that the first and foremost thing that you should do is certainly look at the beneficial nature that these facilities bring to the community. Certainly take into account the benefits of both the environment of recycling these commodities bring to the communities, the jobs. A lot of these facilities are employing the people of the community there. They were built around and employ a lot of the people in the community. And so you should look at the environmental benefits as well as the economic benefits these facilities bring, first and foremost. And then, you know, factor into the compliance mechanisms that they have in place. Many of them have first-class facilities and first-class technology in the facilities that are in compliance with the applicable laws. So certainly those factors should all be put into play and looked at as criteria before you make those determinations. They should not be just automatically included as a stressor. And that we would be very happy to help with the department in any questions you might have and give you any resources that we might have to help you with those questions.
Great, thank you, Danielle. I think we will likely need to be engaging further with you specifically on that. I mean, I think what's helpful there is helping us to understand. I mean, I think I understand kind of intrinsically, you know, the benefits, but you know, kind of looking at how those might be demonstrated would be helpful for us, particularly in terms of employment and other specific benefits that are being brought to those communities, where these facilities are sited. You know, I think also just want to remind folks, you know, if we define a facility to be subject to the environmental justice rules, what that does is really deal with where it can be cited, right, and how it should be cited, and you know how you know in some way its ongoing operations would be addressed, but you know it's not, you know, defining, you know, a Class A recycling facility to be something that is subject to these rules would not prevent new ones from being built. It would kind of address how they should be built and where they should be built. But absolutely, we'd like to continue to talk to you on that front. So thank you so much for that input. All right, we obviously, you know, leaving all of this open, so we can go back to slides if folks think of things later, but we'll just kind of continue to roll forward. Again, landfills, similar approach here as we've talked about, defined under our solid waste rules as sanitary landfills. And those include places where waste is deposited as fill for the purposes of permanent disposal or storage for more than 6 months. And that permit does exclude hazardous waste disposal facilities, which are defined elsewhere. And I think one of the questions, and I think this would go to one of the questions that were received earlier, is certainly how we would need to address hazardous waste landfills. Should they be included in the definition of a landfill? Should they be excluded from definition of a landfill? And to the extent folks have feedback as to why one or the other is appropriate, we absolutely be open to hearing that now, or of course, post this conversation without folks, if folks are not entirely prepared to discuss that point now. Leave that question open if anybody wants to chime in. And we'll move on to sewage treatment plants. Now, this is a place where our regulations do not have a specific and corresponding definition. One possible approach that we looked at, just in terms of pulling from what people might already understand, is to incorporate the definition of treatment works from our NJPT's permitting rules. So that's the New Jersey Pollutant Discharge Elimination System rules. Now, that would include both public and private facilities that store, treat, recycle, or reclaim municipal or industrial liquid waste, including stormwater runoff, industrial waste, and combined or separate stormwater and sanitary sewer systems. This would, we think, would capture the intent of the bill in terms of getting at sewage treatment plants. But this is a place where I'm open and interested in hearing folks in terms of how they think of that in kind of a more a more standard nomenclature. We refer to our rules for almost everything, but if folks have a different understanding of what a sewage treatment plant should be, I'm very interested in hearing that, as well as any of these other things. But if folks have thoughts on that, please feel free to raise your hand and chime in there.
So Sean, I just took a look at the chat and I saw that 2 minutes ago, someone named Lauren Keltos added a comment.
Yes. Yes, comment being recycling facilities can be sources of noise, diesel emissions, dust and odors, which impact communities often without having permits. Yeah, I think that is that's certainly something that we're wrestling with and trying to consider, and that's particularly and specifically why we're asking questions about the Class A facilities, because we want to understand, what those impacts are, what people would indicate are the benefits, and how specifically we should address them, and regulate them potentially differently or not. But that's the open question that we have. So thank you, Lauren. Michael Logan says, under both the solid waste and recycling rules, there are a number of activities that are excluded from specific permitting and authorization by the departments. These facilities generally have a lesser communal impact, but they will be excluded from environmental justice review. Yeah, I think we're going to need to talk about that, Michael. I think that's part of what we're trying to get at here is, we'll talk about the permits as well, but at any time that conversation may be appropriate is, within those permits, within those kind of permitting thresholds, are we missing things in our existing paradigm that need to be thought of differently so that we are addressing stressors, or conversely, should those permitting thresholds be different for the purposes of the environmental justice rule? And I think that's something we want to talk about. And if folks have specific feedback there, we'll dig more into that as when we're ready to move kind of into more of a specific proposal phase. But this is the place to let us know if there are specific aspects in that regard that raise concerns. We have Dan Kennedy. Your hand is up. Dan, how are you?
Hi, Sean. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this. I think simply put, I'd say that using the treatment works approval is too broad.
Okay.
I assume that this is only going to be for systems that have the sized sewage plants that are identified in the legislation.
Yes.
I think there's only
Absolutely.
about four statewide that actually meet that criteria, if my review is right,
Okay.
plus or minus.
Right.
Those systems, those four are older systems. They're actively pursuing upgrades to meet various EPA and state standards. They are trying to get their I&I under control. They're trying to resolve CSO issues and all those basic replacements. Pipes, they all require TWAs. And I don't agree that the intent of the legislation is to have an extra set of reviews to replace pipes in the ground that are already in the ground that we know are broken and failing and not delivering on the environmental goals that the permit's set to meet. So I think without going any more on a soapbox, I think that it's a mistake to use the TWA, and I think you're going to have to come up with a specific definition here, because I think if you relied on the TWA, you'd be catching way too much.
So Dan, let's just for purposes of this conversation, if we use the definition but created other caveats to further process like this, kind of thinking similarly to the point that Toby made about major sources who are doing upgrades to reduce emissions. If what you're talking about are upgrades to replace failing pipes or to do other things, is there a way that could work where you're kind of thinking about this is a broad definition, so we're making sure we capture things, but looking at specific aspects of that permitting as to what would be appropriate to require that additional analysis?
Yeah, I mean, building appropriate off ramps to the traditional definition could be a way to go.
Okay.
But I do think without those off ramps, the strict definition would be capturing way more than the legislation intended.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. Thank you. I appreciate that, Dan. Thank you. It's like I'm hosting a morning radio show.
Thanks.
Thanks for staying off mute so that you could laugh at my dumb joke, Dan. Okay.
Always there.
Appreciate that. All right. No, I seem to have lost my place in my own notes. Sludge, everyone's favorite thing. Sludge processing facilities, combustors, or incinerators. So again, we don't have a specific definition for a sludge processing facility. As we talked about before, we would likely include a reference to the definition of sludge in the incinerator definition to make sure we're capturing that and try to make that as simple as possible. We would also potentially be including a definition of sludge from our solid waste rules and cross-reference to the appropriate disposal method. So part of what I'm trying to get at here is, there are a couple different ways, at least, in my my understanding, the sludge is handled and processed, and we want to make sure that those definitions include the ways that sludge is being processed, so that we don't, if we don't have to, need to create some other thing. So, that would include cross references where appropriate to the landfills, incinerators, and treatment works that might be handling sludge, so that those are covered under those definitions. We could potentially define sludge, as you see on the screen, solid, semi-solid, or liquid waste generated from a municipal, commercial, or industrial wastewater treatment plant, water supply treatment plant, or air pollution control facility, just to kind of talk about what the substance is, and then talk about how it is processed. And I think one of the questions here is, do we need to consider other processing methods? Are there things that folks are aware of that should be addressed? And does this really kind of capture what folks think of in the industry when they're thinking of sludge, and trying to understand how the legislature, what the legislature intended in its inclusion in the bill. Again, we'll leave that out there as we move forward. Please feel free to chime in. And then we're kind of talk about the last of our facilities, and those are scrap metal facilities. And again, we don't have a specific regulation, but we do regulate scrap metal shredding facilities under our solid waste rules, as places that receive vehicles, appliances, and other metals for shredding and transfer. And I think the question for the group, to the extent anyone has input there, is, does that definition cover what folks would think of as a scrap metal facility? Do we need to consider other things? Is there something else that we should be looking at here besides kind of considering these scrap metal shredding facilities? And I'll just take a second. We have a couple questions in the chat. Sally G asks, will the slides be made available? Absolutely. We will provide them to everyone here. They will be available on our website. All of this information is public, and we will endeavor to get it in as many people who are interested hand as possible. Dennis Toft, there should be a distinction between sludge and biosolids that have already been processed and may be used for manufacturing or for land applications. Thank you, Dennis. That's an interesting point. If you want to elaborate on that any more, with kind of helping us to understand what the appropriate distinction is, we'd certainly be willing to have further conversation. But we'll note that and look at it internally. If not, certainly open to hearing more from you. Okay, so I think we've kind of covered the facilities, covered how we might try to draw analogies from our existing regulations, try to keep this as simple and straightforward as we can. I mean, we recognize that these regulations have been in place, some of them for a very long time, and that there is an understanding and a common meaning within the communities and the industry in terms of how these things are regulated. So, to the extent that we can meet the intent of the bill while using what we already have, we'd hope to be able to do that. And again, as we've gone through that, people have questions or comments that they want to raise later, please do. But now we'll kind of talk to, thanks, Dennis. We'll kind of turn to the permits. And, as you can see, it's a pretty extensive list. And we really kind of start with the idea that we would define permits in accordance with our above referenced statutory and regulatory definitions, and apply EJ-specific regulatory criteria where a permit is otherwise required for facilities. So again, we would kind of be using those permitting thresholds, using those permitting requirements as they exist, subject to appropriate modifications that we think are necessary to meet the intent of the bill, and that's what we're trying to dig down into today. So we're going to walk through each of those specific permits, talk generally about what they cover. Again, we'll run through them, but folks have comments on any of the slides, throw that hand up, and I will be happy to stop. Starting with the Air Pollution Control Act permits. Now, these, not surprisingly, are implemented through the Department's Air Pollution Control Act rules, and they govern the emission and activities that result in the introduction of contaminants into the ambient atmosphere. And these would cover things like major sources, as well as incinerators and resource recovery facilities that we've talked about already. If anybody has comments in terms of how we should be looking at that, please feel free to chime in. Solid waste permits. Ray, there you go. I thought you might.
Thanks again. First, I want to echo Toby's comment earlier. I think to the extent that if someone is getting a air facility for a major mod, but they're reducing their emissions, I think that is a good incentive if you could exclude them from this process. It serves the purpose of the legislation to try and improve conditions in the community. I think that you should consider that. I also want to reference at the end of the definition of permit, where there is an exemption for minor modifications of a facility's major source permit for activities or improvements that do not increase, emissions. I would ask you as well in that context not to strictly read the term not increase emissions to be, a zero, one molecule additional. I think the department has the ability to have a de minimis standard in that context. So if there are, again, a minor mod that's making certain, limited changes to a facility, and there may be incidental or, insignificant changes, of emissions as a result of that. I don't think that type of change should bring that facility into this whole process. So I'm not sure, and I'm sure folks like Toby could weigh in later on, if he agrees. But I think you should look for some type of de minimis exemption. It's not unheard of, in the EP's environmental world, where they impose or apply a de minimis exemption from the requirements. I don't think you really want dozens or hundreds of applications coming through here when there's really no impact on the community as a result of that.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Toby, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's anything you wanted to add to that, certainly happy to hear from you now. Oh, we have some hands up. This is great.
Yeah, Sean, actually, I did put my hand up for that, thinking I could help you there too.
Please.
Yeah, I think it's okay to use the definitions that are fairly bright line for minor modification and significant modification in the Title V regulations, but I think we need to tack on some important applicability criteria to that. There are significant modifications. You're using the term major modification. The rule term is significant modification. Significant modifications can be triggered by purely administrative matters. Like if you're triggering a new federal regulation, you could be putting in a cleaner unit that triggers a new federal reg, but you're triggering a significant modification. And that would, again, be an emission decrease, could be an environmental improvement, but it's a sig mod. So if we relied on the definitions, but also said, that it's a significant modification, and it also creates a new environmental stressor or increases emissions, something along those lines. Yeah, that gets us to closer to where you want to be without some additional administrative backlog that isn't going in the it's going in the right direction, not the wrong direction. Again, those are the kind of nuances that I don't want to bore 100 people with, but I'm happy to weigh in on that. And you knows all that stuff full well, but yeah, we can talk about those nuances whenever you guys are ready.
Excellent, thank you, Toby. For the purpose of this conversation, hinting at those nuances is absolutely sufficient to get us thinking and moving in the direction we need to be able to talk about it in more detail. So that's really, really helpful. Yep. Thank you so much.
Fair enough. Thanks.
John Kastner.
I'd just like to echo what Ray and Toby just said, that modifications can be triggered by changes in both federal and state regulations that would represent facility upgrades, would reduce emissions, and to add in the added complications of an EJ evaluation may be counterintuitive.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Ray, you still have your hand up. If there's more you wanted to talk about, I didn't know if that was just still hanging up there or not. Okay. We'll go through some of these. There's some more comments in the excuse me. There's more comments in the chat than questions, so I'm not going to read all the comments necessarily. If there is a question, I will do my best to read it, but please note that all of those comments, we're writing them down, and they will all be taken into account as we move forward here, even if they're not specifically referenced as we're going through. I do see one question mark here, so I'll read it. Matt Carmel from Riker again. Relatedly, the law references an individual permit registration or license. under the discussed laws, is the state considering excluding general permits or other pre-established permits as a result of this language? But I think that's likely. I mean, we certainly do not, we would not be ignoring the reference to individual permits there. I think that if you're talking about general permits and other, and, or, from a land use context, permits by rule, I think, we would likely need to look at excluding those to be consistent with the bill. All of that is under consideration, and we'll be looking at those specific those specific regulations to determine what exactly that encompasses, and making sure that we're not missing anything that is extremely important. But that's a good question, and thank you. Okay, so kind of moving on to solid waste permits. This covers our solid waste and recycling facilities, as we've already talked about. I don't think there's anything particularly surprising here. We talked a little bit about Class A recycling facilities already, which are excluded from the recycling permitting. If anybody has anything to add here, happy to talk about it further. Water resource management permits. Now these deal with from our Water Supply Management Act as well as our Water Pollution Control Act. Water Pollution Control Act, those are under GIPT's rules. I think we've discussed that a little bit already. Talk about discharge of pollutants to surface and groundwaters, and likely covers those treatment works, which Dan and I talked about a little earlier. Water Supply Management Act, those are essentially water supply well permits. So if one of these facilities is seeking a water supply well, we would need to consider whether it's appropriate to require additional environmental justice analysis as part of that permit. And then we move on to the last thing we have to discuss right now, are kind of this category of other permits. Those include our regulated medical waste permits, and those would reference. Actually, sorry, I missed one. Let me slow down a bit. Thank you, Julia. Watershed and land management permits, which I would be a fool to run past. These are the development permits. They protect our water resources, government development in our shore areas, near water bodies, and in wetlands. And I think as folks who've been involved in this for any period of time know that they have the potential to cover almost any facility if it lies within one of those aforementioned jurisdictional areas. And one of the specific questions that I'd like to ask the group, and hoping to get some feedback on either here or later, is should a development permit alone? And that would be a situation where we might not otherwise regulate operations. So the thing I've been talking about, Class A recycling facilities, we're not regulating those operations directly. And we've certainly heard the specific comments on that, but let's just use that for a topic of conversation because it's easy to understand. Are those development permits alone sufficient to trigger the requirements of the environmental justice rules? And that's something that we're looking at and considering to figure out whether it should catch some of these defined facilities as they go through the process, even if we're not getting to them through solid waste or Air Pollution Control Act rules specifically. Thank you for the comments, Sally. And then lastly, we'll go through the other permits. So these include regulated medical waste permits for medical waste incinerators, as well as pesticide permits. And I will be frank with you, we are looking at this and we are not entirely sure how it fits in with the rest of this. And if folks have any input on how the pesticide permits should be incorporated, how their businesses, how their facilities might utilize them in ways that are that kind of fall within the intent of the legislation and into what we're trying to address here, we'd absolutely love to hear it. We'll continue to work on this issue, but I thought it was at least an opportunity to solicit some feedback if anyone has it. And with that, certainly brings the end of my endless droning on. But I'd like to kind of reopen the floor for any questions, comments, if people want to be on the record today on any of this or otherwise, engagement, anything that you want to talk about now. We have some time left, so we'll do that. Mike Eggington, how are you, Mike?
Good, Sean, thanks. And I apologize, I had to step away a couple of times,
no problem.
Multitasking, but your presentation, very detailed, and thank you again. Can we get a copy of it?
Yes, absolutely.
That was my only question, and obviously appreciate the feedback that you gave Toby. And as you know, I do collaborative work on the Clean Air Council, so whatever we can do in there to work with you on all of this, consider us, part of that effort. All right.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. We definitely endeavor to take advantage of all the wonderful resources we have. So Clean Air Council is one of them. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
Absolutely. Mr. Brad Sims.
Hi, Brad Sims with ExxonMobil. One thing I have not heard mentioned is, which I believe is in the legislation, is exemptions for remediation related permits.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I should have mentioned that remediation permits will be exempt. So for any of these facilities or any of these permits, if they're a remediation permit, they'll not be covered by the bill. So that's not going to be an issue. We'll not be changing that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brad. Ray.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that comment about remediation, I'm assuming that if there are permits in the Wetlands Act or any other acts that facilitate a remediation, that they're also exempt as well.
Yeah, I think we're gonna look at that. We'll draw some lines. We'll talk about exactly how that'll apply. I think that line of thinking is reasonable. I don't want to commit specifically until we run through everything, but I can't necessarily disagree with that.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Oh, Matt Carmel, Riker Danzig, hand up. How are you, Matt?
Doing well, Sean. Thank you. I wanted to go back to the geographic unit of comparison.
Sure.
I think I've had enough time now to digest it a little bit more. And the question I wanted to ask is, you presented a bunch of different models. Is the state intending to select one of those models, or alternatively possibly to give an array of models that an applicant could select and try to contextualize as the most relevant comparison out of a set for that EGIS?
That's an interesting question. As we have been working on it now, I think our intent is to try to choose what we think is the appropriate way to do that comparison. I mean, part of what we're trying to do here is create as straightforward, publicly available, and usable a method of comparison that we can. And part of in doing that is, we talked about earlier, putting out that GIS layer. We would intend to build on that layer to include these stressors as we move forward, to include this information. So it's easy for folks both from kind of the developer or applicant side, as well as folks from the community side, to be informed on that choice. And I think it's important for us to make it as straightforward as possible, to make it as publicly available, to make it as frankly objective as possible, in order to allow these regulations to do what they need to do. So, I mean, we'll certainly take that into account. But I think that, at least from my perspective, in terms of sitting here right now, I would probably be reluctant to open it up quite that way. And part of what, but that's, that's subject to further conversation, both, in these groups and internally, to find the right place to be. But part of what we're trying to get feedback on now is, where do people think that right place lies? And if we can come up with an appropriate thing, we'd likely select that as being the method. But it's a fair comment. Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to note that it could cut either way in favor of the applicant or the community, because as we saw under several of your models, it cuts out certain communities in different instances that are included others. So, it's something that is done agnostic to which side you're on in this debate, to the extent there are sides.
There are no sides. I refuse to accept sides. I accept perspectives and conversation. I do not accept sides, but thank you. There's a question in the chat from Philip Savoy. I apologize if I am mispronouncing your name or anyone else's. Will the listing of overburdened communities change over time as business and industry move out of the state and residential housing moves in? How often would the department update these OBCs? I believe we are required to update them every 2 years, and somebody from my team will correct me if I'm wrong, but absolutely, we'll continue to run that analysis within the time periods required by the bill, and we'll continue to update that. What we are fortunate to have is that tool that will allow us to update it quickly and show people where the OBCs do and don't lie as we move forward. Matt, your hand's still up. I'm assuming you're good, but if you want to, okay. All right. Any other questions that folks want to raise? If not, I'm gonna hand it back over to our deputy commissioner to talk about where we're going to head next. And Beram Turin, at what stage of permitting process will the public meeting take place? We're still working on that. That's going to be a topic of a very specific conversation we'll have, and Olivia's going to kind of talk about that a little bit in terms of where we're headed in our other stakeholder meetings, and the placement of the public meetings and all of these other questions, which are obviously teed up by this conversation. We understand that will be addressed at a later date, but again, I think we're just trying to build step by step and get as much feedback as we can so that we get to that point of talking about the process. We will, folks will be well informed as to what we thought about and what we analyzed to get there. All right, Olivia, I'm going to give it back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Sean. So I just want to note a couple things as just a point of follow-up. If you came onto the meeting late, I just want you to know for certain that today's meeting was recorded, and the recording of today's meeting, as well as the agenda and the PowerPoint presentation, will all be made publicly available on our Office of Environmental Justice website. That website is nj.gov/DEP/EJ. And likewise, some of our materials from our first stakeholder meeting are available there as well. You'll find the environmental justice law there. And what you will also find is some information that just came out yesterday in conformance with the legislation. Oh, and I see that Nadia Akbar just dropped the URL to our OEJ website in the chat for your quick reference. What you will also see there is that yesterday we put in the information identifying all the overburdened communities across the state. The legislation gave us 120 days after signing to make that information available to all municipalities so they're aware. So you can go there as a member of the public and peruse that as well. So you'll see some GIS data layers, you'll see some PDF maps, you'll see an Excel spreadsheet. So you'll see that information available in a number of formats. And we're also going to have a webinar. The focus, the audience of focus for that webinar is municipalities. But certainly if you just want to stay attuned to what's happening, it's not a problem if you want to be aware. And that's going to be in early February. We'll send notification out about that. And it should actually be on the FAQ document that's on our website. In addition to that, we do already have some windows of time scheduled for future stakeholder meetings, and you don't have to jot it all down. We're going to make sure we provide it to you and send it out also through our EJ Rulemaking email address. We're looking at the week of February 15th to talk about environmental and public health stressors. In early March, to talk about compelling public need and renewal conditions. At the end of March, to look at process and environmental justice impact statements, and then sometime in the late spring to just have a buttoned up meeting on the whole suite of topics that we've talked about so far. So certainly there's a lot more information that will be coming out your way. Nadia, I'll make one more ask if you can just add the EJ Rulemaking email address to the chat. If you are not already on this list, please send us a note. We'll add you to it so that way you're getting real-time updates with everything that we're doing in this rulemaking process. Thank you. That email address is there for everyone now as well. Are there any questions about our next steps or the process?
Oh, wow.
Okay.
I think we've exhausted everyone, Olivia.
Well, the rulemaking team and our team of scientists have done a tremendous job pulling together this information. So please take your time, and absorb what's been provided. And certainly as a point of follow-up, we welcome, getting your questions and your inquiries so that we make this the best process it can possibly be for all.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. All right. I guess we're done. Thanks, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Hey.